going to draw pictures out. You know that PIP is always higher than plat. You know that static is always higher than dynamic, correct? Over there in lab, you are going to draw generic graphs. Generic graphs. And they're going to have to be labeled correctly. If I'm talking about pressure versus time, what am I putting here? What is it? Centimeters of water versus time. Same thing there. If I'm doing compliance, what am I putting? Units.
Centimeter of water? No? ml? Seconds.
Versus time. Versus time. Okay, if my peak pressure, no, let's go all out. Let's say you walk in, patient's bronchospasms. Bronchospasming, is that a word? A rocket. What's happening? I'm talking about pressures first. So peak pressure is going to go up. What's happening to my plateau pressure?
Same.
In the same, right?
Same.
Does bronchospasms affect your alveoli?
No.
No.
So we're talking about flow versus plateau pressure. No flow. So flow is going to be going through those bronchospasms, right? But what happens when we go to the alveoli? Is those bronchospasms affecting your alveoli? So plateau pressure is staying the same. It's not changing. Not changing. Right? Now, you just gave a what?
Bronchodilator.
Oh, so smart. What happens to my PIP now?
Decrease.
What happens to my plat?
Same.
Uh-oh, we're getting close here. Is my PIP ever going to go?
No.
No. It's always going to be higher. Raw. Raw. Before we move here, let's if your patient, we're still talking about pressure versus time, right? If your patient is developing ARDS, what happens to your plateau pressure? ARDS is said in complete whiteout. Plateau pressure is going to do what? Increase?
Yes.
Okay. Plateau pressure is now doing that, right? So my peak pressure, we'll just say it was right here, has to do what? Has to go up with it. It's going to push my peak pressure up because it always has to be higher, right? The maximum amount of pressure in your lungs at one time. So no matter what, as plat moves, PIP has to move with it. If Mike decides to prone the patient, and Jake decides to give a little Velitri, and Suzanne gives a bunch of bronchodilators with the Metadem, it's been a couple days. That whiteout, complete whiteout on both sides is now 50% better. Great job, guys. And lady. What's gonna happen to my plat pressure? So plat pressure is, remember we're starting here, right? Is now doing this. What happens to my pip? Yes. Rule of thumb, whatever plat does, pip has to do the same. If it goes up, pip goes up, vice versa. If my peak pressure moves up, my plateau pressure doesn't have to do this. The example I gave last year was, just now thought of this. The example I gave last year is Plat and Pip are brothers, okay? Plat's that older brother. Pip always wants to do what Plat wants, that's doing. If Plat's jumping off a cliff, is this your children? If Plat jumps off a cliff, Pip wants to jump off a cliff, right? But if Pip wants to jump off the cliff, Plat's like, I'm older, I'm not doing that. Does this make sense? Whatever Plat does, Pip does. So if it goes down, Pip has to go down. If Pip wants to jump off the cliff, woo, Plat's like, nope, staying the same. Not doing it.
But sometimes it does.
Don't be, shh. You're talking about brothers?
No, sometimes plat goes up when Pip does, right?
Only when Plat moves it.
Right. Oh, only if plat made the decision first.
Right.
Okay.
Yes. Okay, I'm gonna keep going.
I'm so confused right now.
You will be, that's why we do 2 days of lab to make this make sense. Okay, back to our bronchospasms. Our bronchospasms, what's always higher? Static or dynamic?
Static.
Static.
Static. Static is always higher, so static is gonna be on the top. This was the first one, we had bronchospasms, right? Peak pressure went up. So what's gonna happen if we move down here to our compliances? If PIP goes up, what does dynamic have to do? Dynamic, top or bottom? Who's higher?
Static.
So I'm talking about PIP. PIP is related to dynamic, right? So it's got to decrease. It's taking more pressure to go through the airways, correct? If it takes more pressures to get through the airways, your dynamic compliance is decreasing. Compliance is decreasing. That's bad. So dynamic. Plateau is staying the same. What's static doing? Staying the same. Remember the equations? If you write 500, my plateau pressure is 25. Normally, you go in, there's airway resistance. And now, my equation did this. Do you get the same number? Yeah, because we're talking about plat pressures, not peak pressures. Airway resistance. Airway resistance. You came in, you gave that bronchodilator, correct?
Mhm.
That's what happened here, and our PIP went down. PIP went down. What happened? Oop. What happened? Stat. You know that's static. What happened to my dynamic now? My PIP is going down because you just gave a bronchodilator. So what has to happen to my dynamic?
Go up.
You got it. Dynamic is now going up. What happened to my static?
Same.
Stayed the same. Stayed the same. Is my dynamic ever going to go like this? Past it?
No.
Nope. Definitely not. What was the example I used over here?
ARDS.
ARDS. So patient has complete whiteout, correct? complete whiteout, which made my plateau pressure do what? Complete whiteout. What happened to my plateau pressure? It increased, right? We were actually over here first. We increased. Which means, who's higher, static or dynamic?
Static.
Static. So what's happening to my static?
Huge push.
Up or down?
Down. High.
Down.
It's taking more pressure to fill the alveoli. Is that good or bad, Julie? Bad, right? If it's taking more pressure to fill the alveoli, that means the lungs are more stiff, correct? If the lungs are more stiff, is my compliance down or up?
Down.
Bingo. What happened to dynamic? My PIP is going up because of my plaque. What happened to dynamic? It has to go down. Because my plat is moving it up, meaning static has to move it down. Moving over, you did all your stuff, compliance is getting better, right? 50%, the x-ray looks 50% better. What's happening to my static compliance now? Both of these pressures is going down. So my compliance is static is going up. Dynamic is also going up. I just told you the story about the brothers, right? Whatever Platt does, Pip does. If Pip wants to do whatever it wants to do, it just does its own thing, correct? What do you see about this over here?
Static and dynamic do each.
So whatever Platt does, Pip does, correct? Go back to the equation. If I talk about Platt, which one of these am I talking about?
Static. Static.
Plateau pressure is static compliance. So whatever Platt does, Pip does. Whatever static does, dynamic does. So same story. Two brothers, whatever you want to say.
I'm glad I'm recording this.
Static, we got 2 days, we'll make it. This is just the entry. Whatever static does, dynamic does. Over here, dynamic jumped off the cliff. Static said, no, I don't have to do that. Just like up here, Pip jumped off because Pip and dynamic are attached, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Entry, okay? When you start doing it on the ventilator, this is all gonna make a lot more sense, I promise. Next slide.
Also, do we need a break or not?
Yes, please.
Huh? No. I mean, you could take a break, go ahead, but I'm gonna keep rocking, we only have a few more, I wanna get through them and then we're gonna take a break. All right, if we're looking at what kind of graph am I looking at?
Pressure versus time scalar.
Thank you, pressure versus time scalar.
Scalar.
Pressure versus time, and it's a scalar, it's scaled out. See the scales? That's a scalar. That's what you're looking at.
Scalar.
This is your normal, right? You hold that inspiratory hold button, you get that plateau pressure, correct? What's this in between here? Transairway pressure. If that increases, what happened?
Increased airway resistance.
Increase area.
Increased airway resistance. So if we're looking at these, okay, if I'm going from here to here, and it's really not that, what I want you to do, what I want you to do is draw in that little bit, because that plateau pressure should match that plateau pressure. So draw that in first before I talk. Look at the scalar, it's going up 1, 2, 3. So go up that 1, 2, 3 and just draw that little extra. because whoever made this messed up. Does everyone know what I just talked about here? Drawing that little extra. Actually, can you see it better? Let's just leave it right there. That way you can at least see it. So as airway resistance increases, what happens to peak pressure? It's got to increase. So you see it goes from here and goes up at least 1.5-ish, right? Scales, whatever. Plateau pressure, since you just drew it in, what's happened to plateau pressure when airway resistance goes up?
Stay the same.
Stays the same. If we, I can't see that. If we increase the flow, so we go from 40 to 70 on the ventilator, what happens to my peak pressure? Increases. What happens to plateau pressure? Stays the same. So 1, 2, it should be the same as this one, okay? But there is no normal over here. It's just saying when there's high flow, what happens to trans airway? Increases. If we have increased raw, PIP goes up, plateau does nothing. If we have low compliance, when I'm talking about low compliance, I mean static compliance. What happens to plateau pressure?
You mean increases?
Static compliance is decreasing, plateau pressure has to.
Decreases.
Who says increase, raise your hand. Who says decrease, raise your hand.
Wait.
Who has no
Decreasing.
idea? So if static compliance decreases, is that bad?
Yeah.
What does static compliance relate to? PIP or plat?
Flat.
Plateau pressure,
Okay.
because of the equation, right? Tidal volume over plat minus P. If my static compliance decreases, you said bad.
Yeah.
That means it's going to take more pressure, so plat has to increase. If plat increases, remember plat's the brother, what's going to happen to the PIP?
Increase.
It's got to go with it. Is there the same amount of airway resistance? Yeah, because it's not an airway resistance issue, it's a alveolar issue, moving it up. Again, we're just getting into it. Next slide. And just stay there because we're going to fly through this one. We just talked about this. You can look over this. As trans airway increases, so does raw. Next slide. When you're looking at the, what kind of loop am I talking about?
Pressure volume.
Huh?
Pressure volume.
Pressure volume loop. Yes, pressure volume loop. If my loop, my football, okay, you know what the football is supposed to look like, right? Football is supposed to kind of do this. That's your normal, correct? If my football is laying down, come on. If my football is laying down, it's taking more pressure. Where's my volume at as I'm increasing pressure? It's not moving, is it? So it's taking a lot of pressure to pop open alveoli just to get what, 300 volume? Does that make sense? If it takes a lot of pressure to pop open alveoli just to get that little bit of volume, that should be connecting in your brain saying it's taking a lot for plateau pressure, right? It's taking a lot of pressure. So what's happening to static compliance? It's dropping. So that football is going to phase plant. If we're talking about increased compliance, static compliance over what number? Over 60. Remember, 40 to 60 is normal. If we put in pressure, what's happening to volume? If we release pressure, patient's exhaling now, correct? We're almost at 0, and look how much volume is still in the lungs. Do we see that? So as pressure decreases, is volume still staying in the lungs? Even when we're getting almost to zero, we're still high. Who does that? Obstructive. You said it, emphysema, COP, the people that are obstructive. Who has this decreased compliance? Over here, static.
Restricted.
There's your restricted diseases. Next slide. Trending. This is what's most important. I don't really care 1,000%. I do not care if you hit the inspiratory hold button and you get a number. I want to know what it's doing over your shift. So when you're in the hospital, and every time you walk in your patient's room, hit the inspiratory hold button. Know what your PIP is, know what your plat is, and do your new compliance equations. That way you're seeing the trends. We're gonna be doing this for the next couple weeks, seeing what the trend is. If we're going in at 6, 7, and 8 o'clock, don't yell at the answer, take a second here. Plateau pressure has stayed the same, but my PIP has increased, right? Is this increased resistance, decreased resistance? Is this increased or decreased airway resistance?
Increased.
Who says increased? Raise your hand. Yes, absolutely. Is this decreased static compliance? Who says no? Okay, static compliance, is that PIP or plat?
Plat.
So if plat stays the same, static stays the same, right? So what's the only thing what else is moving? Dynamic. Is it going up or going down? Bingo. So we're increased resistance, decreased dynamic compliance. Next slide. All right, next one. What's happening here? Plateau pressure, 1, 2, and 3 a.m., 16, 22, 26, 34, 40, 44. What is going on? Is this airway resistance, decreased compliance, or vice versa? Huh? Okay, what's happening? Increasing or decreasing? Pressures, both of them are increasing.
Decreasing compliance.
But if plat increases, PIP has to too.
I didn't hear you.
If plat increases, PIP has to.
You got it. The reason this is increasing is because this is increasing.
Yeah.
Right? But what's happening to compliance? Huh?
Decreasing.
It's decreasing because plat is moving, static is moving, correct? Those two are the older sibling. Whatever they do, PIP and dynamic have to do with it. So if my plat and PIP are decreasing, what's my static doing?
Increase.
If they're decreasing.
If they're decreasing, is that what I said?
Yeah.
Yeah, if my numbers, if my numbers are increasing, what's happening to my static? Decreasing, which means my dynamic has to do the exact same thing, right? And decrease with static. I think that's it. Next slide. Okay, everything from here on is all practice.